Hello, and thanks for checking out the podcast of Experience-Based Emergency Medicine, the podcast of XBEM. This is Dr. Donald Crow, and on today's 48th episode, I will continue my discussion justifying why I believe that the experience accumulated from practicing medicine for 40 years has led me to the conclusion that there is no opiate crisis, and why accepting this concept has resulted in the propagation of other harmful misconceptions that distract our society from acknowledging and acting in positive ways to address our nation's real problems. Today, I'll discuss what these real problems truly are, and why blaming an opiate crisis only obscures them. Those of you who are unsettled by my statement that there is no opiate crisis will likely counter my argument by citing media stories of tragic deaths and lives torn apart by overdoses on these drugs. Surely this proves there is a crisis and opiates are responsible. I am aware of such reports. For instance, I recently read a Time magazine piece that described 33 deaths, including many young people, in Manhattan over a 3-day period from tainted drugs. But this article does not validate the existence of an opiate crisis. Although it echoes stories that can be found every week on the internet, it was actually written in 1928 and recounted the sad case of nearly 36 deaths due to the ingestion of an alcoholic drink called smoke being served in a speakeasy during Prohibition. This beverage was supposed to be 95% ethyl alcohol plus a bit of food coloring, but was in fact tainted with a significant percentage of methanol. Those who drank it soon, quite expectedly, appeared very drunk and passed out, but unexpectedly they never woke up. Interestingly, during this era of Prohibition, the federal government can be seen as being complicit in this poisoning. This came about because it turns out that, despite the fact that Prohibition became the law of the land, people kept drinking. As speakeasies and underground liquor sales boomed, people who were already drinking began, in many cases, drinking even more, a trend made possible because even though imports had been curtailed by law enforcement, those who wanted to sell alcohol could legally redistill the commercial use alcohol that was still readily available in the U.S. Redistilling was necessary because the commercial alcohols were denatured, meaning that adulterants were added to make it non-drinkable so that it could not be substituted for the ethyl alcohol that was heavily taxed. The government provided guidelines for the redistilling process, which was called purification. Several years into the Prohibition era, when rates of drinking persisted and, in fact, increased as this purified alcohol was being consumed, the government altered the formula for removing methanol from industrial alcohol such that with the new federally supported method, a much larger percentage of methanol remained in the final product, enough that it was acknowledged that a few drinks would cause blindness and a few more would kill. The prevailing justification for this was summed up by a Prohibition advocate from that era's Anti-Saloon League who stated, quote, "The government is under no obligation to furnish the people with alcohol that is drinkable when the Constitution prohibits it." Further, he stated, "The person who drinks this industrial alcohol is a deliberate suicide. To root out a bad habit costs many lives and long years of effort," unquote. In 1933, Prohibition came to an end for a number of reasons, and the deaths from methanol poisoning dramatically declined as those who wanted to drink once again were provided with safer options. Although today deaths from methanol poisoning still occur, they are infrequent enough so that the public policymakers and the media have judged that there is no profit in reporting that there is an alcohol crisis. No, it seems to take something spectacular to support the media's use of the term crisis, and it helps if at its core is something that is unpopular, illegal, or salacious. Once Prohibition ended, alcohol was transformed into an acceptable legal substance overnight, and the methanol poisoning problem that had killed tens of thousands during the previous decade nearly vanished. And our nation moved on to other concerns, since it had obviously solved its alcohol problem. Or did it? If providing safe, revenue-generating alcohol was the solution, why are there more people dying in 2021 of alcoholism than all illicit drugs combined? Why do conservative estimates calculate alcohol costs our society $250 billion annually? Why does 70% of domestic abuse involve alcohol use? Why is alcohol abuse associated with bankruptcy, divorce, and a list of other traumas that goes on and on? But as far as public opinion, as shaped by the media and our political leadership is concerned, we don't have an alcohol crisis. Instead, we are told we have an opiate crisis. This twisted thinking has left us with other fallacious ideas that only serve to distract from the central issue. The reality is we don't have an opiate crisis or even an alcohol crisis. We have a drug dependency crisis. And whether it's opiates or alcohol or tobacco or any other substance that a sufferer chooses, the real pathology is found within the individual and not in the chemical. At its essence, this disease is manifested by the reliance on a substance to get through day-to-day life, despite tangible and undeniable adverse consequences caused by that substance's continued use. This defines the disease of drug dependency, or the equivalent term chemical dependency. The harsh truth that is left after stripping away all the distractions is that the health of 20 to 30% of our population is diminished by this disease. It matters little to your liver or your lungs whether the substance being chronically used is legal or illegal. The child recovering from a beating doesn't care whether his parent was loaded on methamphetamine or beer. The employer scrambling to cover for an absent worker is more focused on his bottom line than the chemical causing his employee's hangover. The real disease is chemical dependency, and the substance is essentially irrelevant. I believe that drug dependency can be best understood as a spectrum similar to many other disease processes, with habitual use of a substance at one end of the spectrum and addiction at the other. What defines where on this continuum an individual lies is the magnitude of the signs and symptoms of this disease process. The signs of drug dependency are often more obvious and easy to recognize than the symptoms. Observable signs include the social, financial, physical, legal, and spiritual consequences of continued substance abuse. The symptoms, the nature of how this disease disrupts an individual's sense of well-being and creates suffering, are often difficult to recognize or even understand by an observer not afflicted with this illness. These symptoms include not just the physical sequelae of systematic poisoning, the nausea, vomiting, headaches, etc., but also the devastating psychological toll that comes from craving, the struggle to control use, and increasingly untenable denial that are the hallmarks of untreated addiction. That the real problem is the disease of drug dependency is not a popular perspective among the many individuals who have a vested interest in promoting the idea that there is an opiate crisis that should be garnering our attention and resources. They would have us believe that using opiates as the preferred intoxicant is a special, distinct disease. They also promise that those who buy into this notion will be rewarded by having at their disposal a safe and effective treatment for this disease. Problem solved. Easy peasy, right? Not only that, but by accepting the paradigm that there is an opiate crisis that is easily treatable, physicians can feel comfortable that they are going with the flow, since these are the prevailing opinions of the self-proclaimed experts in the field who disguise their often self-serving beliefs as being evidence-based medicine. It is always easier and safer to trot merrily along in the center of the herd than it is to venture out in a new direction, even when that direction leads to greener pastures. Unfortunately, those whose voices are the loudest, most persistent, and most widely broadcast, in other words, those backed by the most money, are too often simply accepted as experts. Those promoting the notion that there is an opiate crisis have been busy gathering support for this fallacious idea. They advocate for their beliefs on multiple platforms. Recently, those of us practicing emergency medicine have been bombarded by such opinions, as our most popular continuing medical education programs have been co-opted by self-proclaimed experts that have presented their viewpoints as unassailable fact backed by hard science. One such expert appeared on the very popular podcast EMRAP, Emergency Medicine Reviews and Perspectives, and made several statements about the opiate crisis that he presented dogmatically as the truth. This physician, who is involved in academic emergency medicine and as such teaches young physicians, has advocated for a prevent, protect, and treat strategy in dealing with patients he encounters with opiate use disorder. This therapeutic framework sounds reasonable, but the problem comes with his recommendations on how these goals are to be accomplished. I'm terribly afraid that if young physicians accept his opinions, they will be likely to do more harm than good for their patients. First, this expert says that we must prevent patients from developing opiate use disorder. He makes an outlandish claim that 1 in 15 patients who are prescribed opiates will become addicted to these medications. There's no evidence at all to support this ridiculous claim, and in fact, the best evidence suggests that far less than 1% of those given a prescription for opiates will subsequently abuse them. I'm not suggesting that physicians should not be thoughtful when prescribing these medications. But to withhold an opiate prescription to someone going home with an ankle fracture because the physician is afraid he will, quote, turn that person into a drug addict, unquote, is absurd. The next component of his three-part strategy, protect, is, I believe, the primary opportunity for emergency physicians to have a meaningful impact at reducing the unnecessarily high mortality seen in their patients with drug dependency where opiates are the drug of choice. As I have stated, the primary justification for the idea that there is an opiate crisis are the tragic overdose deaths that are occurring daily in our nation. Emergency physicians must recognize that these deaths are preventable, and we have a unique opportunity to lower our patients' risks if we act appropriately when we encounter them. I wholeheartedly agree with this expert's statements made on the podcast about prescribing, or better yet, providing naloxone for home use to any patient with known or suspected opiate use. I also agree with encouraging such patients to seek treatment. And this leads me to my primary point of contention with this speaker, and that is, what constitutes successful treatment that leads to recovery? The presenter declared on the podcast that the treatment for opiate abuse is replacement therapy with buprenorphine. He further maintained that switching from other opiates to this prescribed opiate represents recovery from opiate use disorder. But the biggest criticism I have regarding this physician's presentation regards his statement that, and I quote, "All experts agree that abstinence does not work and should not be recommended for people with opioid addiction, even though they may come in requesting this." Well, I'm an expert, and I could not disagree more with that statement. First, let me qualify myself as an expert. I've practiced emergency medicine for 40 years, and I've seen over 200,000 patients, tens of thousands of whom were being seen as a direct consequence of their suffering from chemical dependency. Additionally, I spent 2 years serving as the medical director for one of our region's largest inpatient addiction treatment programs. But perhaps most importantly, I have been in recovery myself for the last 23 years. During this time, I've witnessed countless individuals recover from this devastating disease. I watched one individual who literally used to live under a bridge become a circuit court judge, another who slept in the woods open a string of successful restaurants in our region, as well as a physician who lost his license as a consequence of addiction, only to recover and become the chief of staff of one of our local hospitals. In addition to suffering the disease of addiction, they all had one other thing in common, and that is that they stopped using, survived the withdrawal, and then proceeded to learn how to live life without intoxicants. To suggest that abstinence does not work because it requires the motivation and discipline to change reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of addiction. The essence of this disease is that some individuals, when exposed to intoxicants, lack the ability to inhibit further use of those intoxicants, such that over any appreciable length of time, control is lost, use is accelerated, and inevitably adverse consequences accumulate. Those without this condition might have a hard time accepting this definition. But like all diseases, addiction has a pattern of stereotyped symptoms and signs that may be recognized once the physician knows what he is looking for. Recovery from addiction means that the patient achieves a life that is functional and satisfying and free from the signs and life-diminishing symptoms of chemical dependency and continual intoxication. My experience strongly suggests that sobriety is a prerequisite for a successful recovery from addiction. The speaker stated that it is a misconception to say that prescribing buprenorphine is substituting one addiction for another. I contend that this is exactly what is happening. With this treatment strategy, you are substituting one drug of dependency and abuse for another that is hopefully safer, but will still keep the patient living in a life of intoxication and drug dependency. Escaping this miserable life is recovery, and is a process, unfortunately a long and difficult one. But that does not mean it is not obtainable. One of the recognizable signs of addiction is denial, and for a physician to tell a patient with addiction, wishing to escape the never-ending cycle of dependency, that abstinence cannot work is incredibly harmful by reinforcing this denial and may provide the addict the excuse to abandon trying to recover and all of the downstream misery that this entails. My argument is not that strategies using safer opioid alternatives as a bridge to discontinuing drug use are necessarily bad, but the belief that an addict has recovered and is now living a satisfying life because he has switched from one drug supplier who might poison him with carfentanil-laced heroin to another drug supplier with a nice office providing an intoxicating opioid that is likely to be what its label says it is untrue. I will not argue that the addict receiving this reliable drug supply is in fact better able to reclaim his life than he would be while scrounging for dope on the streets, and he is undeniably safer. But I believe physicians have a fundamental duty to their patients to offer reassurance and hope, and to undermine the hope that a drug-free existence is possible is false and contrary to our role as physicians. I wish I had a quick fix for the disease of chemical dependency that could rival the so-called cure touted by proponents of medically assisted treatment with buprenorphine or methadone. But in truth, I do not. Recovery is hard. So is chemotherapy or open heart surgery. Unfortunately, despite the arguments presented by the backers of medically assisted treatment, recovery does not equal simply avoiding withdrawal and reducing the risk of overdose. For physicians to assist their patients in achieving real recovery, an individual approach based on our understanding of that patient before us is likely to bring the best results. Understanding that the addict is living a life of misery and is actively seeking relief is an important starting point. Physicians must abandon their misconception that the drug addict is using their drug of choice for entertainment, to get high. For the vast majority of those afflicted with this disease, the motivation for using is to feel less bad. True recovery involves learning and using tools that will allow individuals to achieve this goal without chemicals, and this is a long, arduous process for most, but well worth the effort for those who persist. Often harm reduction strategies like substituting a safer opioid than the ones they may be using is an option that I believe has merit in the right circumstance. But it should not be disguised as recovery from this disease. Addiction is a chronic disease that will not be cured by any intervention in the emergency department, but pathways exist for patients with addiction to find a life without intoxicants, and physicians should not lose sight of this fact. We don't have to be experts in guiding our patients along these pathways, but we must not allege that they do not exist. I believe that addiction is a crucial topic for discussion among emergency physicians, and one that our CME presentation should continue to feature. This is especially the case since opinions on this disease that we see every day can vary so widely between physicians who earnestly wish to provide the best care for their patients. But a balanced viewpoint at this juncture is lacking. The momentum for accepting medically assisted treatment as a quick fix for the opiate crisis is growing, and this is reflected by a recent policy statement by the American College of Emergency Physicians. This document was released as an evidence-based overview of opiate use disorder and included the recommendation to initiate medically assisted treatment with buprenorphine in the emergency department. Throughout the entire document, there is no mention of opiate discontinuation or sobriety as a component of treatment. Perhaps more worrisome to me is that at the end of this document, they recommend a change of terminology, stating that medically assisted treatment is an improper term, and that the term medical treatment should be used instead, since substitution therapy with buprenorphine comprises the entire treatment for opiate use disorder, and therefore the assisted part of the term should be dropped. This recommendation perhaps summarizes the depth of the misunderstanding of the real problem of chemical dependency and how pretending that instead our real problem is that we have an opiate crisis. Clinging to this fallacy provides the illusion that we are addressing the problem. Unfortunately, adopting this stance will no more solve the real problem of chemical dependency than repealing prohibition solved our alcohol problem. I really wish there were such simple solutions to difficult problems, but in the real world this is not the case, no matter how much we are drawn to the siren song of the easy way out. Thanks for listening. As an emergency doctor with a large amount of experience, I'd like to think that I have saved a few lives, or at least prolonged a few deaths along the way. But I've come to realize that for every successful resuscitation or cutting-edge therapy I may have employed to help someone, I have probably had a far greater impact when I simply encourage my patients to stop smoking, limit their alcohol intake, and wear their seatbelts. I now feel I can add "get vaccinated against coronavirus" to this list of high return on investment health advice, since I have seen more cases of sick COVID patients in the last month than I have seen in the previous 12 months. I often ask my newly diagnosed COVID-19 patients if they have been vaccinated, to which they of course reply no. Then I ask them if they wish they had been vaccinated, and each of them has replied yes, sometimes tearfully. I firmly believe that people have a right to choose, but seeing people swayed by the mindless drivel on the internet making baseless claims against the vaccination has been a sobering reminder of the power of this medium. I saw one so-called doctor stating that it is likely that 600,000 patients have died from receiving the vaccine thus far. Come on, in what universe could these deaths go unnoticed? And yet some seemingly intelligent people give credence to this nonsense. I suppose all we can do as physicians is sincerely present our version of reality and hope for the best. And I will do this as I head off to another night shift where I will greet them, treat them, and street them.